Hello and welcome to Mississippi Insight. I'm Byron Brown. Thank you for joining us. This week we are joined by two of the smartest political analysts in the state of Mississippi. Austin Barbour and Brandon Jones join us from a full-throated discussion on legislative politics, efforts to save the state's hospital network, tax cut initiatives, bills impacting the capital city, the state election season, and much more. It's state political coverage that you can count on this Sunday morning on Mississippi Insight. We are excited to introduce our latest additions to the Political 12 News team. Brandon Jones is a former Democratic member of the House of Representatives and the political director for the SPLC Action Fund and New Southern Majority IEPAC. And Austin Barbour is a national political strategist and also the managing partner of the Clearwater Group, a Mississippi-based lobbying firm. Austin and Brandon, welcome to WJTV.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. Let's begin with the legislature. Thursday, the House voted to provide $80 million in state funding to the struggling hospitals, and then the day before, they brushed off an attempt by Democrats to force the Division of Medicaid to expand coverage. Such an expansion could bring about $1 billion in federal funds, and it's a move that both the Governor Reeves and House Speaker Philip Gunn refused to make. So, Austin, talk about the opposition and what Republican leaders want to do instead to shore up rural hospitals.
Yeah, I will say that Republican leadership at the Capitol, the Lieutenant Governor has made this one of his top priorities to focus on, as you said, our rural community hospitals. These are hospitals that are owned by either counties or cities. They're of all sizes. There are probably 40 of them around the state. And the LG and the Speaker and the leadership there, as well as the Governor, has said, we're going to focus on hospitals this year. You know, we've had a lot of other priorities in years past, but this is one of our top priorities. This year, we're going to get it fixed. There's legislation, SB 2323, which has passed the Senate, passed it unanimously, which essentially gives these rural hospitals more flexibility. Many of them, we hear all the time about the Greenwood-LaFleur Hospital, of course, based in Greenwood, Mississippi, which is struggling. That's a major city in Mississippi, right there in the Mississippi Delta, and it's threatening to potentially close. These hospitals have really struggled, come out of COVID, and many of them are the lifeblood of a lot of these small rural communities, and the legislature under Republican control has said, we're going to do something about it this year, and SB 2323 is one of the tools we're going to use to fix hospitals and help hospitals, particularly our rural ones.
Real quickly, many Mississippians in polls are showing that they support the expansion of Medicaid, and there's many in the medical community in the state of Mississippi that support it. Why are our political leaders against that?
Okay, I just think fundamentally they're against expanding Medicaid because they feel like, you know what? Taxpayers are ultimately going to have to pay for that, just like they do right now. We need safety net programs. I believe this. Republicans, conservatives believe this. We need safety net programs in Mississippi to help the poor, the elderly, the single moms who need help. But expanding a program, okay, like there's some on the left who've decided that they want to do, and some Republicans around the country have decided they want to do. Republicans in Mississippi at the state capitol and the governor feel like, you know what, it's still putting taxpayers on the hook. Let's do other things like this rural community hospital bill that will help strengthen our hospitals, give them flexibility from day one that they do not have to try to survive and ultimately thrive. That's what they're focused on. How do we do this now?
And Brandon, do Democrats have any hope of pushing through or having any chance of getting Medicaid expansion?
Well, it's irresponsible to take that option off the table. I mean, as you mentioned, we're talking about $1 billion per year, which would more than answer what we're losing right now, and these costs that go out the door when someone comes to an emergency room and doesn't have insurance. I think at last count, Byron, we have 28 hospitals in the state that are really on the ropes, that are facing life or death decision making, that could close their doors while we're having this discussion. We're losing somewhere in the neighborhood of $616 million a year in uncompensated care. That's the care I was mentioning a moment ago, that care that you don't recover if you have to treat someone that doesn't have insurance. And so our answer to that is an $80 million one-time program that I think allocates money based on about $6,000 per bed, so that's how hospitals would get money. It is not even a Band-Aid. You wouldn't even call this a Band-Aid over the problem. And so, you know, taking Medicaid expansion off the table in light of the numbers I just mentioned, woefully irresponsible. It would more than pay for itself. it would be something like the state having to match 10% of the 90% that came in. That cost would be overwhelmed by the savings we would get in shoring up our uncompensated care. So it's fiscally responsible. It's the most prudent thing to do. Most people in the state know it. Most Republicans who aren't in the Capitol know that it's the right thing to do. And so you're talking about 2 or 3 people that have decided to be obstinate. And it's, you know, to your question, is there hope for bringing it back? Well, Republicans across the country have found their way to expansion in virtually every state. We're only one of 11 states that hasn't gone this way with some form of the program. And so, yeah, I'm hopeful that at some point somebody wisens up over there and says we can't just continue to be obstinate in the face of these programs. Unfortunately, I'm afraid it may take more hospitals closing, more dire circumstances in our healthcare field before people finally come around.
Austin, what do you say?
My friend over here, for some reason to my right, should be sitting to my left, but that's okay. He and I will just disagree on this. We'll have a policy disagreement on this. In 15 seconds, there are ways to help hospitals right now. I don't think that number is that high. There are hospitals that are struggling. There are ways to help them right now through a grant program. You mentioned $80 million. I think there's probably $100 million on top of that they're working to get to hospitals. Plus, passing SB 2323 gives our rural hospitals more flexibility to how they collaborate and coordinate that they need to survive without having Medicaid expansion.
There's now a related push to expand postpartum Medicaid coverage from 60 days to a full year. What do you expect that to go, and do you support that, Brandon?
Yeah, so I have to compliment Republican Senator Blackwell, who's the chair of the committee in the Senate that has passed this now 2 years in a row. This is an unbelievable one, Brian. I mean, we have talked about, you know, full-blown Medicaid expansion, and I suppose we can debate that, although I don't find that one particularly debatable. But helping mothers and babies in this state that has struggled so mightily to get babies to, you know, the 1 year mark historically is really incredible to me. Where we stand right now is that we provide Medicaid coverage up to 60 days. This would expand that coverage to a full year, which is something that everybody did during those pandemic years. It was something that was mandated by the federal government. I think, Austin, we're down to just one of 2 places that has said no to this. I think we are one of 2 states. The Senate overwhelmingly passed it.
And did last year too.
And did last year too. I think we're looking at Speaker Gunn on this one. He's got to come around on this issue.
Yeah, it's split with Republicans. I mean, just personally, I think we should do this. I think from a fiscal standpoint, we should do this. If you look at the cost of care for a baby who is born prematurely and is at UMC or some other hospital, we're talking 6-7 figures, okay? I think the number to expand postpartum is around 10 million, maybe it's 20 million, somewhere in there. Just do the math. If we can prevent 10 babies, 20 babies, 40 babies from being born prematurely and keeping them out of the hospital for as long as they are, it'll pay for itself.
Well, it just occurs to me too. We just had the Dobbs decision last year. You know, it's something that has been on people's minds. We've had every Republican politician in the state tell us how pro-life they are. We're going to be the most pro-life state in America. Certainly, we have to agree that being pro-life extends to living babies. I mean, if we're going to be a pro-life state, we have to make sure that we are investing resources to ensure that children live full lives. That means taking care of mothers and babies that are at risk after that child is born for up to a year. I know we talk about cost, but to me, it's almost cynical to bring up the cost when, on the one hand, we have a governor who's talking about what surpluses we have, what the budget is. 48 states have found their way to yes on this question.
I think you're arguing with yourself. I agree with you, and it's not just about cost. I mean, cost matters because it is the taxpayers' money, how legislators and executives determine how it's going to be spent. But I agree with you. I think this will happen, and Republicans are pro-life. They're pro-life before the baby's born, and they're pro-life after the baby's born. And this is a big thing, and I'm glad the Senate's passed it 2 years in a row, and we'll ultimately see what happens with it.
We've been talking, one thing that Republican leaders are wanting to do is pass a tax reform. Speaker Gunn and Governor Reeves will support eliminating the state income tax. Lieutenant Governor Hosemann seems to want to pass some sort of tax rebate there. How will this debate play out, Austin? What do you see happening?
I don't know that either of those things will happen this year. I really don't. We are near the end of February. Those were conversations that were had at the beginning of the year. As Brandon knows, as a former legislator, a lot of these fiscal decisions are made the last 2 and 3 and 4 weeks of the session, basically in March. But I don't see a lot of those conversations happening over there. That could be happening behind closed doors. I don't think there's an appetite, a majority appetite to eliminate the state income tax. Could there be some kind of tax rebate? There could. But there are other conversations that are happening. As Republicans, I've always said, we got to prioritize. What are we for? What can we be bold about to do that helps change Mississippi? Doing things to support our hospitals. That's one. That costs real money. How are we going to pay for that? Number two, well, we have a tremendous surplus. Number two, the governor just announced this week a plan to spend $1.3 billion to fix our infrastructure around the state. Highways and bridges, roads that we have, from DeSoto County to the Delta, Metro Jackson, all the way to the coast. So I think what you may see is leadership in the Capitol and the governor saying, you know what, we could try to eliminate income tax, we could give a tax rebate, refund, or we could spend this money on programs that we as conservatives think help everyday Mississippians make their life better. I think that's where the conversation's shifting.
I know, Brandon, the Democrats have been talking about the sales tax, that they want to get that reduced or eliminated possibly. Where do they stand on that issue?
Well, we want to try to get rid of regressive taxes. I mean, we have the highest grocery tax in the country. We have been carrying around that albatross for quite a while. We believe that taxation should be meted out in a fair way. And so, you know, I don't think, frankly, this is the time to be talking about drawing away resources from a state that has historically failed to pay its bills. We have major infrastructure challenges. We just mentioned all these hospitals that are having difficulty finding funding. And so I frankly, Byron, I don't think this is the time to do an overhaul of the income tax system. But to your point, Democrats have long looked at our sales tax and our grocery tax as places for reform.
One of some of the fiercest debates at the Capitol has been over some handful of bills that would impact the city of Jackson. Among them is Senate Bill 2889 to create a regional authority to manage the water system. Also the House Bill 1020 that would create a new court for the Capitol Complex Improvement District. Jackson leaders, they have been asking for support from the state to deal with some of the issues, but they've been fuming over the Republican-led initiatives. Why do you think Jackson has some issues or so divisive with the legislature, particularly when it comes to the Capitol Complex, Austin?
Well, I live in Jackson, okay, so I care about all these issues. I care about our water, I care about our streets, and I care about crime. This, you know, personally matters to me and my wife and our 2 children. I think it's why do they care? Why is the mayor angry? Because he realizes that under his administration and previous administrations, they failed the citizens of Jackson. Black, white, rich or poor, Northeast Jackson, West Jackson, complete failure. Just look, the state of Mississippi had to come in and prop up and fix the water system because of the disaster that it was. People couldn't get running water, they couldn't get drinking water, they couldn't get any water. That was a failure, just a complete failure by leadership in the city of Jackson. Crime. How many years in a row is Jackson, Mississippi going to lead the country in the murder rate? So why is the mayor upset? Because I think when he sees the results, he knows they're a failure. So what's the best way to try to do that? Turn the tables from a political standpoint and blame the Republicans who are in charge, who are essentially trying to come in and help his administration, but more importantly, help the people who live in Jackson. I'm just being truthful with you on that.
And Brandon, do you agree with what he's saying?
No, I was trying to think if I agreed with anything Austin just said, and I can't find anything in that. But I mean, look, I think to the question, the city of Jackson has come to its state for decades now, asking for an investment that is commensurate with what other capital cities have seen across the entire country. Every state capital that has a functioning situation has been helped by its state. Mississippi has long time decided, its state leaders has decided to starve off the city of Jackson. It just simply has. We have not seen the type of commitment to Jackson that we see in Nashville. We have not even seen the type of commitment that you see in places like Atlanta and Austin. We have decided to make this an adversarial process at the state level. Now, as to this recent legislation, the state appealed to the federal government to send down resources for its infrastructure, which the federal government decided to grant. Now we're talking about restructuring the way that those resources are used by something at the state level. That to me is just a very cynical money grab.
But
I mean, why would state leaders worry? We have this new person in who's this czar that's overseeing he has a great track record. He's having great meetings. He's having, to what we can see, pretty decent success. There's only one thing that explains why you would come in to usurp that and those resources, and that's power and money.
The reason, okay, so let me back up. I'm sorry, I'll do this very quickly.
Go ahead.
The reason that the state, what they're doing is there's legislation that would set up a regional water authority, okay? That once the EPA says, hey, we got it fixed, this could be 1 month down the road or 80 months down the road. We got it fixed, we're going back home. Instead of the city of Jackson, again, taking control of the water system that they have just obliterated for years, the power would go from the EPA, if this legislation passes, to a regional water authority that would have members of its board. It's appointed by the governor, the mayor, and so on and so forth. There are dozens of cities across the country that have a regional water authority that manage the water system. Why should the city of Jackson have any more control? This is, my friend, this is not a power grab for money. The state would have no authority over the $600 million that President Biden and his administration sit down here. This water authority would not come into place until all of that money is spent and the EPA walks out of town to go back and focus on another city. Republicans at the legislature, and I hope Democrats and independents would say, this makes sense. Let's have a nonpartisan board who knows what the heck they're doing, manage the city of Jackson's water system once the EPA leaves town, instead of, hey, let's give it back to the city of Jackson. They did such a great job with it. How long did they not collect water bills? I mean, I'm sorry, I'm passionate about this because I'm a Jacksonian. I'll be quiet now.
I believe you believe that.
Yes, I believe it.
The timing of it is terrible. It's only when the money, these problems have existed for 40 years. And so it's only whenever there is money that suddenly we need to rush around to have a board. It at least looks disingenuous. Now look, let's talk about the court bill. The city of Jackson has been asking for additional judges and prosecutors since, I believe, 1992. 1992. Now in most states, what happens is those things are meted out based on population. Jackson has long been the greatest, Hinds County has long been the largest population center in the state of Mississippi, remains to this day. So typically you give your larger populations more judges. You give them more prosecutors. Guess who hasn't done that? For decades, the state of Mississippi. And so we have a crime problem. And that's what people are talking about. I would venture to say that the governor is doing a little bit of baiting when he talks about Jackson being the murder capital of the world. That's actually, that's a little bit of hyperbole. But I won't argue with the fact that we want safe streets. And I think that's a shared commitment at the local and at state level. But rather than giving the county the prosecutorial power and the judicial firepower that happens in most places, they come in with this system that would overlay the citizens of Jackson, people like you and your vote, and say, we're not going to let you select your own set of judges and prosecutors. We're going to come in with our own special system. You don't hear about that happening in any community in our state. In fact, I don't think we've ever heard of it happening in any community in the United States of America. It's a quite anti-democratic concept that you would replace elected officials with appointed officials. And so it's hard, Austin, as an observer of this process and as someone who desperately wants the city of Jackson to be its best, to not see the racial overtones in some of this. This is a majority black city. It's a city with almost exclusively majority black leadership. And it's very hard to watch this back and forth and not think, would it happen this way if this was white leadership? Would it happen this way if this dynamic wasn't what it was? And so I think, you know, Trey Lamar, I know, is very sensitive to this. But when he stood up in the well of the House and he was presenting this last bill we're talking about, he said, I want the people of Senatobia to have a nice place to go and to feel safe when they visit Jackson. Now, that's kind of paternalistic talk that lends itself to the criticism that I'm making. which is this feels race-based. It feels very us against them. It feels like an adversarial system based on political differences and racial differences. And that's the reason that folks like me are so frustrated with what the state has tried over the past month.
Quick response, my friend. For the Republicans that I talk to, who are elected officials, who are non-elected officials like me, who live in Jackson, particularly the ones who live in Jackson or don't, this is not about white versus black. This is about what is working, what is not working, how do we fix it? That's all I can say is just say, how do we fix this? And this is our plan for how to fix this, particularly on the water issue.
Yeah, we know Republicans and Democrats may not always agree on things, and particularly Republicans may not always agree on things, but they have a lock on the House and the Senate, not to mention the governor's office. The question is, can they maintain that control, Austin?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, listen, we're going to have a very competitive race for governor. I think Tate Reeves has done a phenomenal job. Listen, we've got nearly a $4 billion surplus of dollars. We've got, our general fund is nearing $8 billion. Let me make sure I said billion, not million. He's done a tremendous job on bringing new jobs to Mississippi. I think he's in a really good position to win re-election. But Brandon Presley's going to run a very serious campaign. He's going to be well funded by national Democrats. This is a target state for Joe Biden and national Democrats. I think Tate Reeves, if he runs on his record, which I'm sure that he will, he'll be successful in November, but it's going to be a competitive race, no question about it. But I think the governor's in a good position to win re-election.
Brandon, what do you think?
I think most governors with those stats would be in a good position. This governor doesn't seem to be. People feel not very confident in Governor Reeves. His likability numbers have they were not great 4 years ago. They're worse than they were then. And he's running against, I agree with Austin, a very strong candidate, a great retail politician, kind of a political athlete, and Brandon Presley, who's had more town hall meetings than any politician in American government. So he's going to have his work cut out for him. And when you think about, what's the political dynamic in the state of Mississippi, anytime that you can say that top of the ticket is competitive, that could change everything. Yeah. I mean, as Austin knows, Republicans, even during your lifetime, had been in the wilderness for a long time. It took winning that Thad Cochran U.S. Senate seat. Then you get to start putting people in place. It took, some of these various wins that kind of start to put things back together. So if Democrats are successful in mounting a gubernatorial campaign this year, it'd be big. To your point about the legislature, it looks to be a Republican-dominated body for at least the short term, although at this moment that we sit here now, Republicans do not have a supermajority in the House. It's only by about a vote or two. But we have some vacancies. We have some things going on. And I think Democrats will be focusing on trying to prevent them from having a full, supermajority in the House. I think that's where their energy is.
Real quick, going back to 2019, the election cycle, then the last state election, the Democratic Party wasn't as well organized as we thought, and a lot of Democrats didn't show up to the polls. Do you think that, Brandon, that they will show up in this election cycle, or that Democrats will be better organized? Yeah,
people, I feel like, Byron, I keep having to tell people, that race was, I think, a 4.6% race. That was a very close race. There are hardly any states in the country that were that close. We spent a lot of time in the last year thinking about Georgia and Stacey Abrams' race. Leader Abrams didn't come within 5 points of her opponent. And so as much as people have been critical of that race, it was actually very, very close. And so you wouldn't have to have much change in order for it to be a different outcome. And so I think that's something to keep in mind. Will we see greater turnout? I think that has to do with the campaigns. I think it has to do with what happens between now and then, but I think there's a good chance you will.
Austin.
Listen, Tate Reeves has always been the underdog, has always been underestimated. The first time
you sound like Travis Kelce for the Kansas City Chiefs. He's won everything.
I cannot catch a football like that guy can. But he has always been underestimated since the first time he ran for treasurer in 2003 in a three-way primary in the Republican primary. He won it in a runoff. He was the underdog in that general election, and he's in every other race for lieutenant governor. His first race for governor, he was running against Jim Hood, well-funded, who'd won all these statewide elections. And I don't blame and I understand why my friend Brandon Jones and his friends on the Democrat side would underestimate Tate Reeves again. But you know what, Byron? Tate has won every single one of those races because Republicans know who he is, independents know who he is and what his track record is, and I think that's the same situation we'll be in November.
Thanks for joining us this morning. We'll have Austin Barbour and Brandon Jones back in the months to come as the legislative session winds out and the state election season kicks into gear. We'll be back next weekend with more of the political and current affairs coverage that you demand. I'm Byron Brown from all of us here at 12 News. Make it a great weekend.